Good day, friends, and welcome back to Conflicts of the Human Race. Today, I will tell you about the entire story of the Byzantine-Sasanian War of 602–628. Now buckle up as we begin. In the year 602, the Byzantine Empire faced internal turmoil as Emperor Maurice was overthrown in a violent coup by the centurion Phocas. This brutal usurpation would trigger the longest and most destructive war between Byzantium and Persia in history. For centuries, these two superpowers had clashed along their borders, but this conflict would dwarf all previous encounters. The Persian Shah Khosrow II, who had once been aided by Maurice in regaining his throne, used the emperor's murder as justification for a massive invasion. What began as a war of vengeance would evolve into an existential struggle that would push both empires to the brink of collapse and reshape the ancient world forever. Shah Khosrow II Parviz, known as the Victorious, received news of Maurice's death with carefully calculated outrage. The Persian monarch had genuine cause for anger. Maurice had helped restore him to power after his own father's assassination, and their relationship had brought relative peace to the frontier. But Khosrow saw opportunity in tragedy. Declaring himself the avenger of his murdered friend and protector of Maurice's surviving family, he mobilized the full might of the Sasanian Empire. The Persian war machine was formidable. Heavily armored cataphracts, skilled archers, and siege engineers backed by the wealth of the Silk Road trade. In 603, Persian armies crossed the Mesopotamian frontier in overwhelming force. The initial Byzantine resistance crumbled as garrison after garrison fell to the Persian advance. Phocas, preoccupied with consolidating power and crushing domestic opponents, could mount no effective defense against this eastern tsunami. The Persian invasion began with stunning success as General Shahrabaraz, one of Khosrow's most capable commanders, swept through Mesopotamia like a desert storm. Byzantine border fortresses that had stood for centuries fell within months. The ancient city of Dara, long considered impregnable, surrendered after a brief siege in 604. Persian strategy was masterful. Rather than simply raiding, they came to conquer and hold territory permanently. Local populations, groaning under Phocas's heavy taxation and religious persecution, often welcomed Persian rule as liberation. The Monophysite Christians of Syria and Armenia, brutally suppressed by Constantinople's orthodox policies, saw the Zoroastrian Persians as preferable to their fellow Christians in the capital. This religious division would prove catastrophic for Byzantine resistance. By 605, Persian forces had penetrated deep into Anatolia, threatening the heartland of the empire itself. The speed and scope of the collapse shocked the ancient world. As Persian victories mounted, internal chaos consumed Constantinople. Emperor Phocas, paranoid and increasingly brutal, spent more energy murdering suspected rivals than fighting external enemies. His reign of terror alienated every segment of Byzantine society. The aristocracy, the army, the church, and the common people all suffered under his tyrannical rule. Meanwhile, in distant Carthage, Heraclius the Elder, exarch of Africa, watched the empire's disintegration with growing alarm. His son, also named Heraclius, began planning a desperate rescue mission. In 608, young Heraclius set sail from North Africa with a small but loyal fleet, determined to overthrow the usurper and save the empire from complete collapse. The journey to Constantinople was fraught with danger. Phocas controlled the imperial navy and had stationed loyal forces throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Yet Heraclius pressed on, gathering support from provincial governors disgusted with Phocas's misrule. The fate of Byzantium now hung on this audacious gamble. Heraclius arrived at Constantinople in 610 to find a city seething with revolution. The capital's population, pushed beyond endurance by Phocas's cruelties, rose in massive riots. The Green faction of the Hippodrome, traditional rivals of the Blue faction that supported Phocas, declared for the African challenger. Street fighting raged through the districts of the great city as competing forces battled for control. The Praetorian prefect, seeing which way the wind blew, opened the gates to Heraclius's forces. On October 5th, 610, the tyrant Phocas was dragged from his palace and executed in the most brutal fashion. His limbs were hacked off before he was finally beheaded. The crowd's savage joy at his death demonstrated the depths of hatred his 8-year reign had generated. Heraclius was immediately crowned emperor, but he inherited an empire in ruins. The treasury was empty, the army demoralized, and Persian forces controlled vast territories from Armenia to the gates of Antioch. The new emperor Heraclius faced an almost impossible situation upon taking the throne. Persian armies had used the 8 years of civil war to devastating effect, conquering Armenia, Mesopotamia, and large portions of Anatolia. The imperial treasury was virtually empty. Phocas had squandered resources on internal oppression while neglecting the empire's defenses. Worse still, the Persian advance showed no signs of slowing. General Shahin's forces pushed deeper into Anatolia, while Shahrabaraz consolidated Persian control over the eastern provinces. Heraclius attempted immediate peace negotiations, even offering to pay tribute, but Khosrow contemptuously rejected all overtures. The Persian Shah declared that no peace would be possible until Heraclius was brought to him in chains. This left the young emperor with only one option: total war. But first, he needed to rebuild both his army and his treasury. The survival of the Eastern Roman Empire, heir to Caesar and Augustus, now depended on radical reforms and desperate measures. While Heraclius struggled to stabilize his empire, Persian momentum continued unstoppable. In 611, Antioch, one of the greatest cities of the ancient world and the traditional capital of the Roman East, fell to Shahin's forces after a devastating siege. The capture of this metropolis sent shockwaves throughout the Christian world. Antioch was where followers of Christ were first called Christians, and its fall seemed to signal divine abandonment. Persian forces then swept south into Palestine, the Holy Land itself coming under Zoroastrian rule for the first time in centuries. Damascus surrendered without resistance, its population preferring Persian tolerance to Byzantine religious persecution. The ancient trading routes that had enriched the empire for a millennium now served Persian interests. Local Jewish communities, persecuted under Christian rule, often aided the Persian advance, seeing them as liberators rather than conquerors. By 612, Persian armies stood before the walls of Jerusalem itself, preparing to assault Christianity's most sacred city. The siege of Jerusalem in 614 became one of the most traumatic events in Christian history. Persian forces, aided by Jewish allies who had suffered centuries of Christian persecution, surrounded the holy city. The siege lasted 20 days before the walls were finally breached. What followed was a catastrophic sack that shocked the civilized world. According to contemporary accounts, over 60,000 Christians were massacred, and many more were enslaved and deported to Persia. Most devastating of all for Christian morale was the Persian seizure of Christianity's most precious relic, the true cross. Believed to be the actual cross upon which Christ was crucified, this sacred wood, discovered by Saint Helena 3 centuries earlier, was carried off to Ctesiphon as a trophy of Persian victory. Churches throughout the Christian world held special services of mourning, while many believers questioned whether God had abandoned them. The fall of Jerusalem seemed to herald the end of the Christian Roman Empire that Constantine had founded 3 centuries before. With Jerusalem fallen and the true cross captured, Persian conquest seemed unstoppable. Shahrabaraz's armies swept through the remainder of Palestine and pressed into Egypt, the empire's richest and most populous province. Alexandria, founded by Alexander the Great and seat of ancient learning, prepared for siege as Persian forces advanced down the Nile. The loss of Egypt would be catastrophic. The province provided much of Constantinople's grain supply and generated enormous tax revenues. Meanwhile, other Persian armies pushed deeper into Anatolia, reaching as far as Chalcedon, directly across the Bosphorus from Constantinople itself. Citizens of the capital could literally see Persian campfires burning on the Asian shore. Panic gripped the city as refugees flooded in from conquered territories, bringing tales of destruction and despair. Many senators urged Heraclius to abandon Constantinople and retreat to Carthage, effectively surrendering the Eastern Empire to Persia. The darkest hour of Byzantine history had arrived, with the empire's very survival hanging by the thinnest of threads. Faced with the complete collapse of his empire, Heraclius made a decision that would define his reign and change history. Rather than flee to Africa as his senators urged, he chose to stake everything on a desperate counteroffensive. The emperor understood that conventional warfare had failed catastrophically against Persian superiority. Instead, he would take the war directly to the Persian heartland, forcing Khosrow to recall armies from the Western conquests to defend his own territory. This strategy required enormous personal risk. Heraclius would leave Constantinople and lead the campaign himself, something no emperor had done for 2 centuries. To finance this gamble, he made an unprecedented decision: the melting down of church treasures, including precious reliquaries and golden icons. Patriarch Sergius blessed this sacrifice, declaring it necessary for the empire's survival. In 622, after years of preparation and training, Heraclius finally set out from Constantinople at the head of a reformed army, beginning one of history's most remarkable military comebacks. Heraclius's first campaigns in 622–623 were masterpieces of strategic deception and tactical brilliance. Rather than attacking Persian-held territories directly, he struck into Armenia and the Caucasus, regions the Persians considered secure. His reformed army, trained in new tactics that emphasized mobility over heavy formations, caught Persian garrisons completely off guard. The emperor himself proved to be an inspired battlefield commander, leading cavalry charges and sharing the dangers of common soldiers. His personal bravery became legendary throughout the army and reinvigorated Byzantine morale after decades of defeat. The Armenians, traditional allies of both empires, began flocking to Heraclius's banners as word spread of Persian defeats. By striking at Persian communications and supply lines rather than attempting to recapture lost cities, Heraclius forced the enemy into a reactive stance. For the first time since 603, Persian armies were being defeated in open battle, and news of Byzantine victories began reaching the demoralized population of Constantinople. Shah Khosrow's response to Heraclius's unexpected success was swift and massive. Unable to tolerate Byzantine victories in regions he considered permanently conquered, the Persian ruler ordered a general mobilization. Armies were recalled from Egypt and Syria to launch a coordinated assault on Constantinople itself, while Heraclius campaigned in the distant north. In 626, Persian forces under Sharabaraz crossed into Anatolia and advanced toward the capital, while their allies the Avars attacked from Europe. This barbarian confederation had been promised rich Byzantine territories in exchange for their participation in the capital's destruction. The siege of Constantinople in 626 represented the climax of Persian strategy. The capture of the imperial city would end Byzantine resistance forever and establish Persia as master of the Near East. Citizens watched in terror as Persian camps spread across the Bosphorus, while Avar horsemen ravaged the European suburbs. With Heraclius hundreds of miles away, the city's fate rested with Patriarch Sergius and the garrison Commander Bonus. The siege of Constantinople reached its climax when Persian and Avar forces launched their final coordinated assault on the Great Walls. The attack began at dawn with a massive bombardment from catapults and siege engines, followed by waves of infantry attempting to scale the fortifications that had protected the city for 2 centuries. Patriarch Sergius led religious processions around the walls, carrying the Virgin's robe and other sacred relics to inspire the defenders. The garrison, reinforced by every able-bodied citizen, fought with desperate courage, knowing that defeat meant death or slavery. The crucial moment came when Avar boats attempting to cross the Golden Horn were destroyed by the Byzantine fleet, cutting the barbarian assault in half. Persian forces, left without their allies and unable to breach the massive walls alone, gradually lost momentum. After weeks of continuous assault, Sharabaraz was forced to admit failure. the siege was lifted, and Persian armies retreated eastward, having suffered enormous casualties for nothing. Constantinople had survived its greatest test. While Constantinople celebrated its miraculous deliverance, Heraclius pressed his advantage in the distant east. The emperor had formed a crucial alliance with the Western Turkic Khaganate, bringing skilled nomad cavalry to supplement his forces. These Turkic horsemen proved devastating against Persian heavy infantry in the mountainous terrain of the Caucasus. Heraclius's strategy of attacking Persia's heartland, while their armies besieged Constantinople, proved brilliant. Khosrow found himself fighting on multiple fronts with overstretched forces. Persian defeats mounted as Byzantine armies swept through Media and approached the ancient Sasanian capitals. The psychological impact was enormous. For generations, Persians had viewed their homeland as inviolable, protected by distance and natural barriers from Roman attack. Now Christian armies marched where no Roman force had trod since the days of Julian the Apostate. Persian noble families began evacuating their estates as Heraclius's reputation grew to legendary proportions. The Shah, who had once demanded the Byzantine emperor in chains, now faced invasion of his own realm. The war's turning point came at the Battle of Nineveh in December 627, where Heraclius faced a massive Persian army in direct confrontation. General Razad commanded over 12,000 Persian troops, including the elite Immortals Guard regiment, in a desperate attempt to halt the Byzantine advance toward Ctesiphon. The battle raged from dawn to dusk across the ancient plains where Assyrian kings had once ruled the world. Heraclius personally led repeated cavalry charges, his golden armor gleaming as he cut down Persian champions in single combat. The emperor's tactical genius shone as he used feigned retreats to draw Persian heavy cavalry into traps where Byzantine infantry could surround them. When Razad fell fighting heroically in the battle's final phase, Persian resistance collapsed entirely. The road to Ctesiphon lay open, and with it, the possibility of capturing the Sasanian capital itself. News of the victory spread like wildfire throughout both empires. The tide of war had turned decisively. Following his crushing victory at Nineveh, Heraclius advanced on the Persian capital of Ctesiphon, the great city on the Tigris that had been the seat of Sasanian power for 4 centuries. As Byzantine armies approached the massive walls and towering palace complex, panic gripped the Persian court. Shah Khosrow II, who had confidently rejected all peace offers just years before, now faced the humiliation of foreign conquest of his own capital. The city's fall seemed inevitable as Persian armies had been shattered and no significant forces remained to defend the heartland. However, internal Persian politics intervened before the final assault could begin. A conspiracy of nobles and generals, led by Khosrow's own son Kavad II, decided that the Shah's ruinous war policies had brought the empire to disaster. In February 628, they staged a palace coup, imprisoning the once mighty Khosrow in his own dungeons. The King of Kings, who had dreamed of conquering the entire Roman Empire, died in captivity just days later, murdered by his own guards. The new Shah Kavad II, faced with imminent conquest and complete military collapse, immediately sued for peace with Heraclius. The young Persian ruler had no choice but to accept devastating terms that reversed all of his father's conquests. The Treaty of 628 required Persia to evacuate all occupied Byzantine territories, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, Armenia, and Mesopotamia, returning them to imperial control. Most importantly for Christian morale worldwide, the Persians agreed to return the true cross and all other religious relics seized during their conquests. Thousands of Byzantine prisoners, including many high-ranking officials and military officers, were freed from Persian captivity and allowed to return home. The treaty also required massive Persian reparations to compensate for war damages, further crippling the Sasanian economy. For Heraclius, these terms represented complete vindication of his desperate strategy. In just 6 years, he had transformed catastrophic defeat into total victory, recovering an empire that had seemed lost forever and restoring the true cross to Christian hands. Heraclius's return to Constantinople in 629 was the most magnificent triumph in Byzantine history. The emperor entered the capital in a golden chariot, bearing the recovered true cross, while crowds of hundreds of thousands lined the streets in celebration. Church bells rang throughout the city as Patriarch Sergius led thanksgiving services in Hagia Sophia. The great cathedral packed with worshippers praising God for the miraculous victory. The true cross was restored to its place of honor in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, returned by Heraclius himself in a solemn pilgrimage that moved the Christian world to tears. Persian prisoners marched in chains behind the imperial chariot, while captured treasures filled wagon after wagon in the victory procession. Poets and chroniclers hailed Heraclius as a new Constantine, comparing his achievements to the greatest emperors of the past. The empire that had seemed doomed to extinction just a decade earlier now stood triumphant, its territories restored and its enemies humbled. Despite the celebration of victory, both empires had paid a devastating price for their 26-year struggle. The Sasanian Empire never recovered from the massive expenditures and territorial devastation, entering a period of civil war and economic collapse that would prove fatal. Kavad II died within months of making peace, and Persia descended into chaos as rival claimants fought for the throne. Byzantium, though victorious, was similarly exhausted by decades of total war. The empire's population had been decimated, its economy ruined, and its military resources depleted by the enormous effort required for victory. Most ominously, both empires had fatally weakened their southern frontiers, where a new power was stirring in the Arabian Peninsula. The followers of Muhammad had watched the great empires exhaust themselves in mutual destruction, and Arab armies would soon pour out of the desert to conquer territories both powers thought permanently secure. The last great war of antiquity had ended, but it had created the conditions for an even more dramatic transformation of the ancient world. The Byzantine-Sasanian War of 602–628 marked the end of an era that had defined the ancient world for over 4 centuries. The struggle between Rome and Persia, between Christianity and Zoroastrianism, between West and East, concluded with both civilizations mortally wounded by their final encounter. Heraclius's incredible military genius had achieved the impossible total victory from the brink of annihilation. Yet the cost was so enormous that it prepared the way for his empire's later defeats. Within a decade of the Great Triumph, Arab armies would conquer Syria, Palestine, and Egypt with shocking ease, taking advantage of populations exhausted by constant warfare and empires drained of resources. The Sasanian Empire would fall completely to Islamic conquest by 651, while Byzantium would lose 2/3 of its territory and retreat behind the walls of Anatolia. The ancient world of Caesar and Khosrow, of Constantinople and Ctesiphon, had fought itself to death, making way for the medieval age of Islam and the Crusades. If you liked today's story, make sure to check out our other videos on our channel. Have a nice day.